Ever heard that story? Well, that's good. So anyway, but it's very good, so. Except if this thing is very heavy. But it's kind of good that it's like this. I wish all my stories kind of were because it won't get ruined so quick and it's big. The story takes place in Russia, and that's a map. I'm not very much into maps.
But you want to be.
Is this good enough?
Yeah.
Pasha Tamikrov was an 8-year-old boy who lived in the country of Russia. He and his older sister Shura, along with their mother and father, were an average family who lived peacefully in the village of Sosnovka in the region of Mogilev. They worshipped regularly in the Russian Orthodox Church and enjoyed the respect of all those in their community. On the holy days, the local Orthodox priest would visit them to play cards with the father. They would play the game Dulachki, where the winner would throw the pack of cards at the loser's nose.
Oh.
Sometimes the priest and Pasha's father would send Pasha to the store for liquor. Then the competition would intensify and the game would become a bit more rowdy. The priest, whom they called Batushka or father, didn't see anything wrong with drinking, even though the Bible forbids the drinking of alcohol. Pasha and Shura would look with amazement at the priest's nose as the priest's nose would become a brilliant red. They did not know if it was because of his drinking or because he would constantly lose and get thumped on his nose with the cards.
Oh, dear.
The Tikamirov family continued to enjoy a peaceful life until several bad harvests compelled the farmers of their little village to move. Tomsk, Siberia, an area with fertile farmland and cold temperatures, was chosen as their new home. They promptly sold their land, and in 1897, the farmers of Sosnovka and their families boarded a train on their way to a new life. The journey was slow and difficult. The trains on which they rode had to make long stopovers in Samara, Chelyabinsk, and Tomsk. Sometimes they had to wait for weeks to get on trains that traveled further, so they spent days and nights sleeping on the floor in the small railroad stations. The traveling villagers could not afford to buy warm food at the restaurants, so they ate dried fish and drank unboiled water. Thus, they grew weary and some became sick. On the last leg of the journey before they arrived in Tomsk, Mr. Tichomero fell ill. And I'm not going to pronounce these words very well because at first they give you pronunciations and then I forget and they're not there anymore. The doctors diagnosed him with the deadly disease of cholera. His wife and children were horrified as he was taken from the train and placed in the hospital for those with contagious diseases. Mrs. Tichomero, Pasha, and Shura left the train as well. They found refuge not far from the hospital behind the snow fences along the railroad tracks. Every day they would go to inquire about the condition of their father, but he only grew worse. 3 miserable days passed and the children woke to find their mother struggling with the same dreaded disease. Tears were streaming down their cheeks as the soldiers came to carry her away from her children to the hospital. Her children ran behind the stretcher crying out for their mother until the heavy hospital door was slammed in their face. They were heartbroken. The cruel guard shouted, "We'll give you a whipping if you don't get out of here." They would not listen. If they could not live with their parents, they wanted to die with them. They ran around the hospital crying until the evening came and colder weather settled in. They wept as they huddled together to keep warm. Shura did not close her eyes at all that night as she held her brother Pasha. The next morning when they went to see their mother, the guard said, "Do not come again. This morning we carried away the body of your father, and your mother is also likely to die today." The children were crushed. They crept next to the windows and tried to get a glimpse of their mother. Later that evening, they told their mother had died. They were deeply saddened by this horrible loss, and they sobbed all night long. As they shivered together in the cold, dark night, Pasha spoke of death and of throwing himself in front of the train. Shura was terrified. She took her brother in her arms and cried, "No! For nothing in the world will I go with you to cast myself under the train. Neither will I let you go. This is so terrible." They held each other tight and waited through the long night for the break of day. In the morning, they left their second home by the fences and ran to the cemetery, thinking they might see the grave marking of their parents. They stopped the keeper of the cemetery and asked where their parents might be buried. The keeper coldly snapped, "Do you know how many bodies were carried out here last night? How could I know who was buried here? Besides, many bodies are usually thrown into one hole." With eyes red from weeping, the children looked through the fence surrounding the graveyard. Their hearts broke with sorrow as they observed the wet, irregular mounds of clay. They were oppressed with sadness as they considered all that had happened to them in the past several days. Now they turned away to the snow fence and considered what they would do next. The darkness of night and lonesome fear swept over them that evening. The thought of being placed into an orphanage seemed horrifying, but they knew that it would save them from hunger and possibly even death itself. Their food had run dry and their money was gone. They had nothing but each other. Shura tried to be a mother to her little brother, Pasha. She kissed him and tried to comfort him by saying, "We shall not despair. God will not forsake us." The next morning, though the birds were singing cheerfully, sadness hung over them like a cloud. They decided to follow the railroad to the next village to beg a bite of bread. Just then they heard a gruff voice above them. "What are you doing here? To whom do you belong?" An unknown uniformed man appeared before them and looked sternly into their eyes. Shura and Pasha were nearly frozen in fear. They couldn't begin to imagine what he would do to them. Shura and Pasha were horrified as they stood before the officers. Their tongues felt swollen and their mouths were frozen. They were completely unable to tell the dreadful events that had just happened to them. The soldier commanded them to follow him, and he led them to the distribution office. There the decision was quickly made that they would be sent to the orphanage. Will we be sent to the orphanage? No, it could not be. This meant that now Shura and Pasha would be separated. The girls' and boys' orphanages were several miles from each other. They had tragically lost their father and mother. Would they now lose each other? Through tears and cries of agony, they pled with the soldiers to leave them be, but to no avail. Shura ached for her brother. She gave him one last hug and assured him that God would not forsake them. Then Shura was taken to the girls' orphanage and Pasha to the orphanage for boys. The orphanage proved to be worse than imagined. 300 boys welcomed him, not with smiles and handshakes, but with coarse jokes, shoves, and pushes. The needs of the children were constantly neglected. Fights broke out again and again, and the meals of dried fish soup at dinner were more than he could handle. He could hardly believe this had happened. Pasha thought of only one thing for the next week: how and when he would run away. He waited and watched for just the right time to flee this awful environment. And we will end there.
How old was